How are we all? Good. You'll notice some slight decorations around the wall today. They are not ants. I can assure you of that. They are meant to be footprints, and I think they kind of show a journey or a path. And next week there'll be something else added to that, because we're beginning a new sermon series, which is building on from what we've been talking about with discipleship, and we use those 4 chairs as a model. So we're now starting to look a little bit more deeper into I guess why Jesus did what he did, and start to unpack that for ourselves, so that we not only just do what he did, but actually we know why he did it. Because simply repeating something that happened 2,000 years ago with no further understanding is not very helpful to any of us. Anyway, some people are asking about the footsteps, and that's what they're about. You know, when we look back on our childhood, I think almost everybody in this room, including myself, has at one point or another tried to wear someone else's shoes. Would I be right about that? Yeah. Maybe when you were a child, it was your mother's. You wanted to put on her high heels and run around. Maybe your dad's, I don't know, not his high heels, but that could have been the case too. We don't judge in this place. Or perhaps it was a big brother or a sister's. It might have even been someone who you simply admired and wanted to be like. I know my sister used to run around with a hairbrush and sing with NSYNC, if anyone remembers those. So when she's watching this online this week, she'll probably, give me some nice texts back. But that's what it was like. We wanted to be who we weren't. We wanted to be someone else, some people that we admired. I remember for me, it was my dad. When we grew up on the farm, I'd always, put on his gumboots, and I asked Rod to get me some really big gumboots this week, and clearly there was a difference in understanding of what I meant big, because this is what we call tall in New Zealand, and this is what we call small. Okay, not big and long. Okay, but I used to wear his gumboots, and I'd say that because they don't really fit properly. In fact, they're not fitting at all. So if I fall over, but I would wander around in his gumboots like this, and I'd be following him left, right, and centre all over the farm, trying to drag electric fences out, and shift the sheep and all this sort of stuff, and get stuck in mud and all that. I was now I look like I'm in high heels. Glad thing we don't judge in this place. But I remember trying to keep up to him in the paddocks as we walked across. I wanted to be like my dad. He was a tough, very short, but manly type of guy. He was big, thick-set shoulders, and he had this beautiful, big, thick soup strainer of a moustache and curly hair, and clearly I haven't got any of those things. But he was a farmer, and I really wanted to be a farmer. Like in New Zealand, the farmer and the All Blacks are like the typical, you're men. If you're a farmer, you're a man. If you're an All Black, you're a man. If you're anything else, well, you've got hope to live up to. That's how it was in New Zealand, and so I wanted to be a farmer, and for a while I got to do that. But he got to play on big boy toys and drive tractors and trucks all day long, use welders and even shear sheep, and I loved it. I wanted to be like him, so I looked up to him as a young child. But in trying to be like him, I gradually discovered for myself that wearing shoes that weren't mine clearly are ill-fitting, right? It just didn't work for me. God had made Dad uniquely Dad, but he'd also made me uniquely me, and he asked me to be me, not my dad. And so when I tried to do everything that Dad did, and it didn't seem to quite work out, and sometimes I made more of a mess of things than I should have, but it was almost like a bit of like John Cleese in the Ministry of Silly Walks. Anyone seen that? When he's all over the stage kind of walking? Go home and YouTube, watch that. It's fantastic. But it felt like that. It never seemed to be right. And it was really difficult in trying to do this and imitating something that I was never called to be. Just take off my high heels now. Ugh, sorry if I wrecked your gumboots, I'll replace them, I promise. Or Wellingtons. What do you guys call them here? Gumboots? It is gumboots, great. I'm just making sure we're not that different. It is gumboots. You know, as Christians, we're called to imitate Christ. We're not called to imitate anyone else other than who Jesus is and what he is and why he did what he did. We're not called to imitate John Bon Jovi or NSYNC or anything else. We're not called to imitate the coolest minister on the block or even our best friends or anything. We're actually just called to imitate Christ, because it is Christ who draws out the best in who he has uniquely made us to be. We need to understand that it's also that it's as we imitate him, to be fully imitators of him is not just simply to understand what he did, but understand the why, the greater why behind what he did. 1 John 2:6 tells us, he says, whoever claims to live in him, that's in Jesus, must live as Jesus did. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. The key word there for me is as. It's only a small word, 2 letters, tiny, but it has such a bigger meaning in this scripture verse. It asks us to look deeper into the bigger reasons of why behind he did what he did. I remember back in the 90s. Anyone born in the 90s in this room? Were in the 90s? You lived in the 90s? Raise your hands. I can see yous. Yeah, everybody did. Exactly. It was a trick question. All the kids have left. Come on, guys. Anyway, we used to have these bands, the WWJD. You remember that? Yeah. You can still get them from Coorong. I'm a bit of a fan. I quite like the WWJD bands. They were all the rage in the 90s. Huge. It was awesome. Everyone used to wear them. We used to give them out at youth camps and as youth leaders and all this sort of stuff. It was great. And people would wear them everywhere to simply witness to their lives that they belong to Christ. They often served as a reminder for people to stop and think before making actions and choices that they made, making sure that their responses or their reactions imitated that of Christ. And so there's nothing wrong with their WWJD bands. In fact, I'm quite a fan. But I wonder if something in the 90s with those bands, we actually sold ourselves just a tinsy-wincy little bit short. I'm wondering whether, because and the reason why I say this is simply because I believe that our Christianity, and more specific, our discipleship that he calls us to be, has become so orientated in what we do. That's how we actually become identified, what we do. We're either this, or we do that, or I belong with this, or I help out at that. It's what we do that we've become identified rather than who we are becoming. We become, as I said, identifiable by the various groups that we've joined or the various missional tasks that we contribute to. So today I want to suggest something slightly different with the WWJD bands. Because I'm a fan of them, I like them, I think we could all wear them if we wanted to go out and buy them ourselves. But instead of saying what would Jesus do, it should be what would Jesus desire. Still works with WWJD. What would Jesus desire of us to do? Just recently, we had to fill out our 10-year review documents. So in a few weeks, Sarah and I are going to disappear for a week over to Port Lincoln, and we're going to dive with some great white sharks, and one of us is going to at least come home, and it'll be fantastic. And we're going to sit on Zoom, and because we can't get back to New Zealand, and we're going to do our 10-year review with people with this the bigwigs over there. And they asked us to do some paperwork. And in this paperwork, we've been asked to reflect on the past 10 years of ministry. Now, if anyone has ever tried to reflect on the past 10 years of ministry and try and contain it within 300 words, it becomes a little bit ridiculous. But for me, it basically boiled down to this, that God wanted me to get away with him. You know, as I reflected back, I thought about it. I thought the times that I got into trouble, the times that I got hauled in front of the DC and told to come on Shane, pick up your ideas, the times where I invested myself in things that was unfruitful, when I got busy doing things and I wasn't becoming. I was so focused on the doing rather than what he was desiring of me to do. And so I've boiled down the last 10 years that God wants me to get away with him more. I was walking in other people's shoes when I got into trouble and when I did things that were unfruitful, or when I felt that something was ill-fitting. And I was doing all of that because I was doing things that God had not prepared for me to do. You know, in Matthew 11:28-30, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's encouraging them here halfway through the Gospel of Matthew, and he's saying to them, to prioritize their relationship with him. He has disciples at this point of Scripture as they're stuck between these two worlds of this Pharisaic and the Sadducees and the law and following all these regimented rules and regulations, and yet Christ, who calls them to simply come and walk with him and have a relationship with him. And so the disciples, wanting to be this, are still stuck over here in this mindset. And so here in Matthew 28-30, he encourages disciples to get away with him, to prioritize a relationship with him and not to be sucked into those rules and regulations, to be doing the things just simply that we do or the boxes that need to be ticked. But he encourages them to be present with him, to be present with him, and to learn how he walks and the shoes that he's wearing and that he has prepared for us. And so he says to them, are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burned out on religion? I don't know about you, but man, all the dreams and wishes that I had of COVID, I'm saying, I'm not going back to that hectic lifestyle. Well, they're back. And I wonder what happened. And so he says to them, come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I think of Aaron and Lauren as I say this right now. 4 kids. Get away with me, and I'll recover your life. I'll show you how it is to take real rest, to walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it, he says. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace, Peterson writes. When Jesus spoke of these unforced rhythms of grace, he means that there needs to be an ease and an enjoyment. And I don't know about you, but when I wear someone else's shoes, there's nothing comfortable, there's nothing easy about standing up on them or in them or walking like it. It's difficult, it's tough. You end up struggling and straining, trying to be something that you're not. You're flopping around all over the place, uncomfortably, tripping over your own feet, all the time trying to simply earn forgiveness and favor that was always yours to have. Doing the things for approval of others. He never said you need to do this. He said, I want you to be this. Come away with me, he says. Walk with me, work with me. Watch how I do it. You hear it? Come away with me. Walk with me. Work with me. Not by yourself, not on your own. There's an intimacy in the relationship with Jesus. It's about being with him and doing it together. That's key to learning to be his disciple as we grow more and more like him. It's not only about what we do, but it's also, like I said, why we do it. In the passage that Sarah read earlier, and I'll read it again very shortly, in Philippians 2:5-11, the Apostle Paul writes, or perhaps even actually copies an old hymn, and he sends it to the church of Philippi from his prison cell in Rome. And he writes this letter when he's locked up in Rome, and it's a letter of joy with gladness on his heart. Here he is in some dark cave with chains around his ankles, and you can imagine the dampness and the cold and maybe a bit of bread here or there. And he writes with joy and gladness on his heart. He's encouraging his friends in Philippi with him. He's thanking them for the gift that they've sent him, yes, but more so for them not to worry about him because he's in chains for Christ, he says. This is what Christ had prepared for me. And so I have joy and I rejoice in this. I know because I'm present, even in my prison cell, with Christ. And actually, I can continue to grow the gospel, share the gospel. I continue to act as though I would on the outside with love to my prison guards and share with them Christ. And so he encourages friends in Philippi to do the same. And that's why he writes to them. And he says this: in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset of Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name above all other names, that in that name of Jesus that every knee will bow in heaven, on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father, just like you guys sung before. Even from prison, here Paul was learning, teaching, and applying Jesus' unforced rhythms of grace. They weren't ill-fitted or even silly looking, because he was being who God had created him to be. So I wonder if you heard or seen in that passage this morning those unforced rhythms of grace. In your discipleship, he says, and growing to be like Christ, he calls us to have the same mindset of Jesus. To be humble is the first kind of unforced rhythm by grace that I see. It's to know that true humility is not so like to think lowly of yourself and to put yourself down, but to think rightly and truthfully of who you are and who Christ has made you to be in order to accomplish his will. But humility is also about acknowledging your own limitations. To know that we can only be in one place at one time, and most of us can only be accomplishing one thing at that time, or at least 50% of us in that room. We have limitations as humans, and we've got to be humble about that. Trying to take on more than what we actually can, and not realizing that leads to burnout and stress and fatigue. And there's nothing about unforced rhythms of grace in that. You see, Jesus, while he was here on earth, was like us. He could only be in one place at one time and spoke about one thing to multitudes of people, of course, but he was limited. He had limited resources of energy to spend. We have limited resources of energy to spend. That's why it's really important for us to understand what would Jesus desire is far more important than what would Jesus do. The second thing I noticed about the unforced rhythms of grace in this passage was that he calls us to serve. You know, we're to take on the nature of a servant. Did you know in 13 weeks' time we're going to celebrate Christmas? Isn't that cool? 13 more Sundays or Mondays waking up, and you can cross them off, and there under the tree will be your socks and undies. Isn't that cool? You know, at Christmas time we celebrate a Jesus who came to earth as a baby, not born in a palace, not born as in a wealthy family with all the resources and not all the everything else, but he was born to a refugee parents in a barn. And that his whole life from the moment he became here on earth was geared to serving others, to be a servant. It was Emmanuel is his name, God with us. In Mark 10:45 it says, even the Son of Man did not come to serve, but come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And we're called to do the same, to serve others, but to do so in a humble attitude, to know of our limitations. The Apostle Paul continues in Philippians and he encourages them to be obedient to God. It's another unforced rhythm of grace that he has. You see, to be disobedient is to do your own thing or to wear shoes that don't fit, to try and be something that you're not. And when we do this, what happens is that we actually succumb to temptation, right? I mean, we know this. We fall down that line of temptation, either looking at stuff we're not supposed to look at, or taking stuff that we're not supposed to, or saying things that we shouldn't. And it's when we do that, when we fall down that line of temptation because we haven't been obedient to Christ, it becomes the very opposite of unforced rhythms because we struggle and we twist and we turn and our stomach gets all knotted up. We hate being in that sin. We wrestle with it. And yet we're called to be obedient to God's voice, to listen and to hear. In that passage we talked about before in the NIV, it talks about that God has a yoke for us. It's a training bar, if you like, that he wants us to saddle up alongside him, to walk with him. And he says that training bar that he has is actually easy for us, and the burden is light when we get used to it, when we get used to walking in those unforced rhythms of grace. It's not ill-fitting, and it certainly is not silly looking. Lastly, the unforced rhythm of grace that I noticed was that Paul was reminding us to exalt the Father, to heap praise on God, to draw people's attention to him and not to ourselves. It is God who works with us and through us. And we're on a journey with him together, walking in the shoes that he's given us. It's all about him. It's all about, as was said before in the testimonies, the cross. And we get to proclaim that. And actually, when we proclaim that, it becomes an unforced rhythms of grace because the pressure is not on us anymore. See, when we skite about ourselves and we say, oh, look at me, I'm wonderful and I do this, then we've got that to keep up to. And we've got to maintain that in the future. But when we exalt the Father, the pressure is all of us, and his yoke becomes easy and the burden light. It's our job to give him the glory and to lead others to him and to know, as that's said at the bottom of Philippians 2 there, that his burden, that every knee will bow before him. And they'll finally know that of the life-giving salvation that he has and the freedom that he has to offer. As we learn these unforced rhythms of grace post-COVID, don't slip back into the craziness. We remind ourselves as we're learning these of how to walk in his steps. Over the next few weeks, as we head towards Advent, we're going to focus on these unforced rhythms of grace that he has. How did Jesus walk? What was it that he did, and why did he do it? So that we learn something from 2020. Something positive and something hopeful and something that we could take into the future. I don't know what God's still, small, quiet voice is saying to you right now. But for me, 2020 has served as that reminder that we have but one life to live. And I can struggle, I can do it my way. I can keep fighting and pushing and wrestling and all that stuff. Or I can learn from him and I can point others towards him. Yes, I might get knocked about by others. I might get accused of stuff that I haven't done. It might be hard to climb the mountain, as it was said before. I may even get restricted from seeing my family and my friends. But God is still with us. As I said last week, he is still faithful. And it's about our job to walk in his steps and follow him. Those unforced rhythms of grace that he has. Our next song that we're going to sing, one of our songs that I want to sing, is a response to this. And I invite you to just simply stay seated where you are now. But it talks about following him. It talks about letting him lead you and guide you. I want to draw your attention to verse 4 where it says, with every breath I long to follow Jesus, for he has said he'll bring me home. And day by day I know he will renew me until I stand with joy before his throne. And then the chorus that follows says this, to this I hold my hope is only Jesus, all the glory evermore to him. When the race is complete, still my lips shall replete, yet not I, but through Christ in me. He wants you to walk alongside him today, tomorrow, and the rest of your lives. And as we learn from 2020 and we go into 2021, as we celebrate Christmas as it soon approaches, and all the hectic nature of life that is about to hit us, as we try to manage Christmas in a pandemic and how we're going to work all that out. And yet he says, walk with me, don't struggle. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace that I have, because it's all about me. So give me the glory. As we sing this song through this morning, I want you to stand when you're ready. It's one of the reasons why I darkened out the hall this morning, because I wanted you to feel that you could respond as you wanted to respond. Not the next person sitting beside you, not your husband, not your spouse, not your friend. But just respond when you are. And when the words of the songs strike a chord with your heart or your mind, when you get the tinglings down your spine and God's saying, I'm speaking to you right now, then you stand as a sign of, I guess, positive affirmation, positive response to what God is doing in your life. So please, as we sing this song through, stay seated, and when you're ready and when you feel God's leading, stand and sing with us.